In the United Kingdom, a Secretary of State is a cabinet minister in charge of a government department. There are a number of Secretaries of State, each formally titled Her Majesty's Principal Secretary of State for ... Legislation generally only refers to the Secretary of State, without specifying which one. By virtue of the Interpretation Act 1978, this phrase means one of Her Majesty's principal Secretaries of State. These positions can be created without primary legislation, nowadays at the behest of the Prime Minister. History. Kingdom of England. In the Middle Ages, the kings of England were attended by a cleric called the King's Clerk, and later Secretary, who dealt with their correspondence. Until the reign of Henry VIII, there was usually only one secretary, but under him a second appeared. In the time of Elizabeth I, these men gained the title Secretary of State. With cabinet government after 1688, the Secretaries of State took on higher duties. The posts came to be known as the Secretary of State for the Northern Department and the Secretary of State for the Southern Department. Both dealt with home affairs, but they divided foreign affairs, so that one dealt with the Protestant states of Northern Europe and the other with the Roman Catholic states of Southern Europe. The Secretary of State for the Southern Department ranked above the one for the Northern Department. After the Union, in 1708, after union with Scotland, a Secretary of State for Scotland was appointed, but the third secretaryship disappeared from 1742 until 1768, when a newly reinstituted third secretary began to take charge of the increasing administrative work of the British Empire. In 1782 came the new posts of Home Secretary, dealing with home affairs, and Foreign Secretary, dealing with foreign relations. The third secretary again disappeared, and the charge of the colonies was transferred to the Home Secretary. However, owing to the War of the First Coalition with France in 1794, a third secretary reappeared to superintend the activities of the War Department. 7 years later, the colonial business became attached to his department. In 1854, a fourth Secretary of State gained the exclusive charge of the War Department, and in 1858 a fifth secretary began duties. These 5 Secretaries of State remained constant thereafter until after the First World War. In the post-war decade, 3 new Secretaries of State were instituted. One for the Royal Air Force was split out of the War Office, one for relations with Britain's self-governing dominions was carved out of the Colonial Office, and a minister responsible for Scottish affairs was raised to the level of a Secretary of State. This situation remained constant until after the Second World War. At the independence of India in 1947, the India Office and the Dominions Office were merged under a single Secretary of State for Commonwealth relations. A year before, the Secretaries for War and Air had lost the status as cabinet-level ministers due to a reorganization of British military command, being subordinated to a new Minister of Defence, and were finally abolished in 1964 and replaced with a new Secretary of State for Defence. A few years later, with the increasing contraction of the British Empire, the Colonial and Commonwealth Relations Offices were merged, and in 1968 the responsibilities were subsumed within those of the Foreign Secretary. By this time, however, the entire concept of a Secretary of State had been largely transformed. As Prime Minister Harold Wilson began in 1964 the process of transforming nearly all of the various ministers and board presidents which made up the British cabinet into Secretaries of State. By the end of the 20th century, virtually all departmental cabinet ministers were Secretaries of State, with the notable exception of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. In contrast to the general stability of the secretaryships before the 1960s, the exact number and duties of the various Secretaries of State has been very fluid, with only the Foreign and Home Secretaries, the 2 original Regional Secretaries of State, maintaining a consistent portfolio. Current positions: First Secretary of State, Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, Secretary of State for the Home Department, Secretary of State for Scotland, Secretary of State for Education, Secretary of State for Defence, Secretary of State for Wales, Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Secretary of State for Transport, Secretary of State for Health, Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, Secretary of State for International Development, Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Secretary of State for Justice and Lord Chancellor, Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, Secretary of State for International Trade. The honorific title First Secretary of State is awarded occasionally. It has been in existence since 1962 and was last in use from 2009 to 2016. Obsolete positions: Secretary of State for the Northern Department, Secretary of State for the Southern Department, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Secretary of State for the Colonies, Secretary of State for War, Secretary of State for War and the Colonies, Secretary of State for India, Secretary of State for Air, Secretary of State for Dominion Affairs, Secretary of State for Commonwealth Relations, Secretary of State for Industry, Trade and Regional Development, Secretary of State for Education and Science, Secretary of State for Economic Affairs, Secretary of State for Commonwealth Affairs, Secretary of State for Employment and Productivity, Secretary of State for Social Services, Secretary of State for Local Government and Regional Planning, Secretary of State for the Environment, Secretary of State for Employment, Secretary of State for Energy, Secretary of State for Trade, Secretary of State for Industry, Secretary of State for Prices and Consumer Protection, Secretary of State for Social Security, Secretary of State for Education, Secretary of State for National Heritage, Secretary of State for Education and Employment, Secretary of State for the Environment, Transport and the Regions, Secretary of State for Transport, Local Government and the Regions, Secretary of State for Constitutional Affairs, Secretary of State for Education and Skills, Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, Secretary of State for Business, Enterprise and Regulatory Reform, Secretary of State for Innovation, Universities and Skills, Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills and President of the Board of Trade, Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change,